Welcome to the Passion and Soul podcast, an exploration of personal and interpersonal desire, faith, and connection. Your host, international sexuality and spirituality author and educator, Lee Harrington of passionandsoul.com, will take you on a sultry and intellectual journey through the soul of intimate experience. Take a moment and breathe deep and get ready for an adventure. This podcast is a chance to glimpse into the ever-increasing diverse world of alternative life. The Passion and Soul podcast is intended for mature audiences. If you are offended by adult topics or prohibited by law, we recommend you stop listening right now.
Hello, fellow adventurers of sexuality and spirit, and welcome to the Passion and Soul podcast with your fellow adventurer, your guide, your journey mate along the way, Lee Harrington. It has been a crazy trip for those who have been following me on my journals and my journeys. I've finally gotten back to Alaska after, of the last 9 weeks of road travel, only 2 of them have been home total. And I am so delighted to just get to have a little bit of drizzle, a little bit of downtime. Because as much as I enjoy some of my lifestyle of getting to go out and see everyone and have these grand adventures, I don't know if there's anyone out there who just is glad occasionally to come home and watch a extra few episodes of television or get to read a book from time to time. And even for those who, say, oh, I don't travel that much, those times where you work too long, I go, you know what? The paycheck might be nice, but so's that soul recovery time. Because every single one of us refuels in different ways. Some of us are introverts, who are people who are refueled by having quiet or alone time. Some people are extroverts who are fueled by having outgoing time or time around large amounts of people or time to be outgoing and vivacious. And I think for myself, it's a blending of the two. I love getting to have time to go out and connect with lots of people and have that bigness. But there's other times where I refuel by myself, sitting in bed, reading a book, going out on a long walk with myself or a bike ride with my dog. Or for folks who follow me online, actually know it's trike, because then I can do grocery shopping. And I love that. And I love getting to have a podcast like this because it lets me connect with those of you who are introverts, who I'd never have a chance to meet going to these big conferences and connecting. And I appreciate you for listening on the other end of this line because we have a chance to connect in different ways. And I am delighted getting to do this work of being on this show as well, because I get to have people to connect with at long distances, such as our next guest. I have talked with this individual in bits and pieces over the years on the internet and gotten to recently have them come on and be part of one of my projects that's going to be coming out next year, the Queer Magic Anthology, Power Beyond Boundaries. And I've really appreciated the work they have put out there on the number 69 Sex Educators Union group, on other Facebook groups, and in general getting to have them pop up in my various feeds from time to time because they're folks who are going out and doing some of the work in the world as well, which I appreciate. Now, this person is Aida Manduley, who's an award-winning Latinx activist, therapist, and sexuality educator, known for big earrings and building bridges. Queer in both gender as well as sexuality, with a wild love for technology, they work to shape up the landscapes of mental health as well as anti-violence. From the New York Times to the Rainbow Times, Mix Manduley has been interviewed by a variety of media outlets for their work around community organizing, sexuality education, and various forms of social justice projects. Born and raised in Puerto Rico, they graduated with their bachelor's in gender and sexuality studies from Brown University and their master's in social work from Boston University. In the literary realm, their playgrounds are sexuality, death, and violence. And they raise queer, trans, and people of color experiences to the front. While most of Manduley's words are from nonfiction and prose, including some curricular journal articles, their love of writing poetry runs pretty deep. And you can find more at aidamanduley.com. And welcome to the show, Aida. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here with you.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, it's been such a delight having voices like yourself on that sex educator, sex therapist, sexuality activist group that's on Facebook. It's been so wonderful seeing that kind of blossom with yourself included in the discussion.
Yeah, I love, part of what I love about the internet is the opportunity to connect so many people, like you were saying earlier, that are in disparate places in their life, geographically, and all of that, because we have so much to share. And the fact that we have a variety of media right now that can enable that kind of conversation is wonderful, and I think has done a lot of good for a lot of different marginalized and under-resourced communities to see, oh, wait, there are more of me. I'm not the only one, and now I can have a sense of community. So I'm really excited about that.
Oh, absolutely. I remember when I first got into the kink communities a little over 20 years ago, and publicly, and I remember folks being like, oh, there's not anybody who's combining sexuality and spirituality. I'd be like, well, actually, I do know of a few people down here. And nowadays, I could point anywhere on the globe and find folks. Or when it comes to social justice, the activism that's been able to happen with various protest work that's happening nowadays that would have been impossible without platforms like Snapchat, Facebook, or Twitter.
Exactly. And the fact that, so much of this has a rich history, right? So none of this is new, this idea of protest, this idea of revolution. And yet there are so many ways that it has been reinvigorated and so many ways that we have achieved different kinds of success and different kinds of reach because of those tools that are now available. But part of what I think is really important there too is figuring out, what if some of those tools were taken away or changed, just thinking of the different terms of service that different websites have, different platforms have, and how things that we have come to depend on and rely on a lot technologically sometimes can just be taken away pretty quickly. And so thinking of how do we maintain our movements and how do we ensure that we have the bandwidth emotionally, personally, professionally, and the resources and the community strength to, continue doing the work regardless of some of those tools. So it's this like multi-pronged approach that I'm always looking at. And maybe it's, a little bit of misanthropy and pessimism that there's fear of, some of these things can be taken away. What do we do then? How can we be prepared for possible changes in that arena so that our movements don't just crumble?
Well, absolutely. I remember, I'm not remembering which country it was. It was in Northern Africa. There was, right after the Arab Spring movement went through Egypt, there was a push in one of the countries to have something happen as well. And they literally just cut the lines to the internet. They cut the actual hard lines. The government did, because, well, if everybody's disseminating their information through all those online platforms, what if we just cut it all off? Because the government had access to other modes of communication.
Exactly. And I mean, we're seeing that right now. I have some friends and colleagues right now that have been banned on platforms like Twitter or Facebook for no valid reason. And, that's where also we see the hypocrisy in a lot of corporate platforms and a lot of corporate environments like Facebook, like Tumblr, like Twitter, where it's very easy to ban folks that are speaking out about racism and speaking out against injustice. And at the same time, you see accounts of white supremacists and, folks that are advocating for violence against minority groups keep their accounts, suffer no consequences or very few. And that's, again, that's why I think the value of and the importance of making sure that we have multiple strategies, multiple ways of connecting with each other is so important. Because again, what if those things get cut off? Do we have other ways of meeting our needs? And in my head, it looks like a web. It looks like a spider web, where if we have more points of connection, more ropes that tie us to other folks, the harder it will be to unravel us, the harder it will be to weaken us and bring us down.
Well said. Yeah, every single year I go on to my phone platform and I print out a print copy of everything on my phone. Because what if your phone goes down, right? Do I still have the ability to show up physically somewhere? I know so many people that maybe they have 2 phone numbers memorized. Maybe. And what happens if you are the one who's been protesting and needs to call someone? They're going to give you your smartphone back. Right?
Yeah.
You need to have at least one phone number memorized.
Yeah, I've had friends where their phones have been smashed in front of them by the police, where it's like, oh, oops, it fell. Okay, it fell under your shoe, cop. But that's something that can be very hard to prove. And for me, I think that also speaks to the importance of digital security and having folks, even if they don't know a ton about computers or technology, getting some idea of what can make their information more secure, having information duplicated or saved on multiple spaces, not just their computer, not just an external hard drive. And all of this really, to me speaks about feeling safe and feeling like you can be yourself and you can have pockets of safety, online as well as in person. And that's one of the biggest things that I deal with as a therapist too. A lot of the folks that I see, regardless of what it is that they're coming to me with, so much of it is about reinstating a sense of safety, particularly in the current political climate that we have.
Now, what are some of the tools you give to folks about creating that sense of safety?
One of the pieces is finding, what communities you're a part of and what communities you want to connect to, because especially if you're really isolated, it can be really hard to sometimes even see the worth in living. I have a lot of folks who struggle with suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation, and having community, whether it's online or in person, doesn't really matter. Having some place where they feel like they are not the only person facing a struggle is huge. The other piece is I work a lot with folks to get reacquainted with their bodies and get more into their bodies, especially for folks who've experienced trauma, especially folks who feel like their body's a dangerous place if they're trans or if there's any kind of gender question. Working on befriending their body again, working on acknowledging the parts of it that hurt, but knowing that the body is not a monolith. The body has a lot of different pieces to it, right? And we talk about holistic care and holistic bodies, but we can sometimes break it down to have a more nuanced understanding of it. So we live in a culture, I think, and a variety of cultures that can get very black and white, it's either A or B. There's no other option. And whenever I see that, I'm like, what's the third way? What's the third option? There's always one. There's always something else, right? And sometimes we're just too caught up or have been taught over and over that there are never more than 2 options. And we can see that, we can talk about that later in terms of gender. But when talking to folks thinking, it sounds like you have a really binary perception of your body. Can we make that more nuanced? Can we complicate that story a little bit more so that it's not just, well, my body's terrible. It's this terrible place full of pain, has never been good, will never be good. Yeah. And starting to make that a little bit more, again, the word is complication, the word is nuance, and getting them to feel like there may be parts of their body that feel safe, parts of their body that can feel positive and have hope for joy within them or the capacity in the future. The other piece too that I like to do a lot with folks is, and this is related to community, but this is also related to body, is getting folks connected to ancestry and their ancestors, whether that's blood lineage, blood ancestors, or folks that are ancestors in a community like queer and trans, folks who have passed. And that I think also brings a sense of like internal revolution to folks sometimes. And for folks who may find it very difficult to be present and find it difficult to take care of themselves, folks who may find it difficult to not think about dying all the time, sometimes when we bring up the idea of ancestors, sometimes when we bring up the idea of all those who have made it possible for us to exist and the ways that we can honor them through existing and through experiencing pleasure, that's sometimes the switch that turns in their brain, and they're like, oh, okay, I think there's a reason for me to live. I think there's a reason for me to exist right now.
Is it that notion of at least I get to live for them because they couldn't?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And also sometimes it's just about channeling rage, frankly. I think that rage is a really powerful emotion, and it's not the only one we should be using as fuel. Rage is very flammable and burns bright and fast and hard. But if you don't have anything else afterward, or if you don't have anything else beyond the anger, movements are not sustainable. Joy is not sustainable. Change is not sustainable. So along with using rage, I like to sort of channel folks into other emotions as well. But rage is really powerful. And sometimes if all that keeps you alive is just being mad at the current political climate and just out of stubbornness, you're like, no, I'm not going to kill myself because I'm just so mad at the current political system. If that's what it takes for now, I'll take it. Like, we can use that rage. Rage is really powerful.
I love that. I'm getting involved with a body that's doing a lot of intersectional work. And in doing so, that's one of the things we've talked about is, okay, we're doing all this work right now. And so one of the ideas for it, we're having a get together in October. And so I've asked everybody to actually help us build an ancestral altar. And it's not just about, like you've talked about, those blood ancestors, which are so important, but also to be, okay, we are building movements on the shoulders of giants and taking that moment to respect and honor them and to be reminded why we're doing this work and how we even have the possibility to do any of this work.
Exactly. And that work can also be really complex if you're disconnected from your ancestry, disconnected from your ancestors.
Yeah.
If we look at the United States, how many folks here, and here I'm specifically thinking of folks who are immigrants, specifically thinking of folks who survived war and genocide, or their families came to the U.S. after war and genocide. I'm thinking of folks who who are the descendants of slaves here in the States. And there's so much disconnection. And there's also, in the desire for connection, a lot of mistakes, I think, that we make that are things that we could, move away from doing. I think that in the desire for connection, the desire for spiritual awakening, the desire for pleasure, and all of these like really wonderful words and concepts, sometimes we get involved with spiritual traditions that aren't our own, and are not part of our history. And that can be okay, right? Because some spiritual traditions are open, some spiritual traditions have, a very invitational stance toward newcomers. But I've seen a lot of folks get really excited about traditions that are closed, where you cannot be part of it if you haven't been invited in. You can't be part of it if you're not of a particular, lineage. And I see a lot of entitlement to like, well, why can't I? Why can't I be there? Why can't I be part of it? Why are you denying me spiritual awakening? And I think no one's really being denied spiritual awakening. Spiritual awakening can come through so many different paths. And it's a matter of figuring out what is authentic and unique to you, and what honors and supports and acknowledges the history of struggle that so many of these spiritual traditions have had to face in the U.S. and abroad. And that's a conversation that I don't see as much in sort of mainstream spiritual discourse. And when I say mainstream, I don't mean actually mainstream. I mean mainstream for folks that are involved in queer and trans spaces, folks that are involved in sometimes more quote unquote alternative faith practices. And I would love to see more of that dialogue going on.
Oh, I can't remember if I brought it up on the show or not before, but I went to a panel that was being done of First Nations of Europe, religions that had never been shut down by Christian belief systems. And it was people who were various practitioners, and there was a gentleman from somewhere in Eastern Europe who, through his translator, was talking about this concept that he has been running bonfire jumps. He's in his 50s or 60s, and he'd been running bonfire jumps since he was in his 20s, and his grandfather had run them before, and his grandfather before that. And yet his son and grandson were making money now by folks from England and the United States coming over there to see, quote, real pagans in action. And be part of, quote, real pagan belief stuff. And the reason that they didn't show up at the actual rituals was because when folks showed up to the actual rituals, they went, well, but this isn't what paganism looks like. They were there doing spiritual tourism.
Exactly.
And this person was just like, we appreciate the money, but my children are making decisions based on their need for money and choosing not to attend our faith practices anymore because that's not where they can make a dollar.
Yeah, and I think that also just shows the ways that politics, culture, and all of these things influence spirituality, right? Spirituality does not exist in a little vacuum or silo. Capitalism, globalization, all these things, racism, all these things affect spirituality. And one of the things that I want to definitely convey to listeners of the podcast is it's okay to have messed up. It's okay to have made a mistake. The question is, do we come back from that mistake? Do we acknowledge that it happened, or do we try to bury it very deep? I think that there's a lot of power in being transparent around those mistakes. It gives permission to other people to be transparent and acknowledge what has happened. Because when folks make mistakes, often what happens is they get a shame or guilt reaction. They try to hide. They try to, hide all evidence that something wrong occurred, whether that's a big harm or a, quote unquote small harm. And it makes people lose faith and lose trust in them, and makes people, lose trust in the communities that they were a part of, especially if those folks were leaders. And I think there's a lot of power, and I would love to see more people admitting when they've been wrong, especially folks who are seen as professionals, especially folks who are seen as leaders in spiritual traditions, because if we're not changing and if we're not growing over time, what are we doing? The point is to evolve, to grow, to get better at what we're doing. And we're not going to do that without messing up. And so I just want to, give permission to folks to have those moments of, yeah, I was doing this faith practice and I was not being authentic about it. Or, yeah, I was doing this culturally appropriative, shitty thing and I have learned better, and this is what I'm doing differently now. Like I've had a lot of friends and folks in my circles where they started off with a particular faith practice, learned more history, learned more about activism and social justice, and were like, oh, I should not have been doing this in the first place. I'm going to gracefully get myself out of this. And I think that that's, that can seem sad to some people, right? Of, oh, now I lost this place where I had put in so much energy. I lost maybe my connection to a spiritual body or spiritual community. But I think that can be reframed as an opportunity for further growth, an opportunity to take what you learned there and apply it to a new setting. It's really a space for transformation. So mistakes don't have to be seen as these horrible things that we have to hide, but points of acknowledgement, times when we get to repair the harm that we've caused in a community and move forward, move to a different stage of our lives, move to a different stage of organizing. And I see it as an opportunity rather than as this horrible thing that we did that now we have to be shameful about forever. And now we are going to be mad at those who called us out or mad at those who kicked us out of community, and I feel like that's one of the things that is missing from a lot of that dialogue, right? Where there's a mistake, then what happens after? Can people find healing after the fact? And I feel like if people realize that it's okay to mess up. And when I say that, I'm not saying that you're going to make everyone happy when you mess up. I'm not saying that people are not going to be upset at you, because they probably will, especially if it's a sort of big mistake, or a big form of harm. But that there is stuff afterward, and that there is the possibility of, still having hope, still having faith, still having a system. And I feel like that would make it different for people if they realize that, or if they internalize that a little bit more. They'd be less afraid to say, yeah, no, that was culturally appropriative. I'm not going to put on this like feather headdress as a white person. I'm not going to try to get involved with calling the orishas and stuff around Santeria if I have not even been in relationship with any practitioner or any santero myself. So that's one of the things that I definitely wanted to make a point to say, because I think that can be transformative stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Having seen some of that happen with folks realizing that this is not where they should be treading necessarily, or not, they didn't have a full awareness of what they were doing, what are some steps for those individuals and for the communities that they've affected in moving forward, other than saying, I'm sorry? Like, are there things, especially for folks who have been the ones who had it affect them?
Right. So if they're the person who has caused harm or made a mistake, and those are different things, right? Like a mistake versus intentionally causing harm or even accidentally causing harm, those are on a spectrum. So I'm not talking about, I'm not necessarily talking about abuse here. I'm not talking about gross violations of consent. I think that deserves a more nuanced conversation than what we're able to do right now in this time frame. But if someone realizes, hey, I've been messing up, or they get called out for something that was a problem or that was harmful to a community, particularly a community that's been, traditionally marginalized or traditionally under-resourced or subject to violence, apologies are really important. Acknowledging what happened is really important. And there's an art to apologizing, right? It's not just, I'm sorry you felt that way, because that's not taking accountability for what you did. It's saying, I'm sorry you had a feeling. You had an emotion that was hurt, and it sucks to be you, right? So if we're apologizing, it's really important to name what happened and take responsibility for whatever piece we were responsible for. So, hey, I'm sorry for saying that thing that harmed you. I'm sorry for saying that thing that hurt you. Part of a good apology to me is also understanding the context. So not just giving a knee-jerk, oops, I'm sorry, but, oh, I'm sorry, my words were harmful. Now I understand that there is this context, blah, 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 blah. So part of apologizing and part of repairing harm, repairing mistakes is understanding the context. And to understand, you either have to listen or you have to research on your own. Ideally, you would be doing both. And that takes time. So repairing harm doesn't happen overnight. And if we're expecting it to, we're just going to set ourselves up for failure. So we have to expect that it'll take some time, that we have to name what happened, that we have to acknowledge it to whoever it needs to be acknowledged to. And to me, one of the biggest things is changed behavior. So if someone apologizes consistently but keeps making the same mistake, keeps causing the same harm, that will raise my eyebrows. I'm like, did this person learn anything? Was this person honest? You can spit a good game. You can say, I'm sorry, very eloquently, very gracefully, 20,000 times. And I've met folks who do that. I'm like, you're just saying the same thing over and over. You're not actually changing your behavior. So for me, one of the ways that apologies and mistakes can be mended is beyond the acknowledgement, changing your behavior. And again, that takes time. You have to prove yourself. Trust is very easy to break, but it is very hard to regain and build back. And again, here the transparency train, choo-choo, come aboard. Can you be explicit about the changes that you're making? Can you be explicit about the things that you will do differently in the future and hold to them, right? And take it a step further. Do you check in with your friends, with your family, with your community about the mistakes you've made in the past and see how you're doing now? Because sometimes we'll apologize, we'll make a mistake, we make the initial reparation, and we don't talk about it years later. Like, I'm really curious about those conversations. Those are the ones that I think are really juicy, right? Of like, hey, I did this 10 years ago. Let me see how I am doing now. Can I check in with myself even? It doesn't have to be a community project, but can I check in with myself even? Have I changed? Have I started doing things differently? Or am I in the same place? Am I stagnant in whatever it is that was an issue 10 years ago? Right? So those to me are some of the immediate ingredients. The other piece around listening is asking if people have the bandwidth to have the conversation, what they might need to feel healed, what they might need to feel safe. Some people just want to be heard. Like, if you have hurt someone, sometimes they just want you to know that it hurt. And they don't need you to do a ton more beyond that. Some people do need more things. Some people will need more concrete action. If we're talking about, and here I am going to slip into a little bit of violations of consent territory, but
yeah, go for it.
If some folks have caused harm in the community, even unintentionally, part of the work is not just, oh, I admit it, I did this bad thing, blah, blah, blah. Part of it can be a request from community members to stop participating in a particular space or event for a period of time. I don't super believe in lifetime bans, because a lifetime ban means that there is no hope, that there is no thought that this person can change. I do believe in temporary bans. I do believe in temporary conditions for change, because that gives an incentive for change to happen. And it also acknowledges the possibility of that change actually taking place. That said, there are sometimes when levels of toxicity in a person or in a community reach such levels that, yeah, a pretty long ban has to take place. But I don't think that that should be our first option. We should have more options in our menu of options to deal with mistakes, deal with consent violations, deal with harm, whether it's coming out of a place of malice or not. And looking at the diverse ways that we can do that. And again, kind of bringing you back to what I was saying earlier of, do we have a multi-pronged approach? Do we have multiple options for how to deal with this? Or do we just have a hammer so everything looks like a nail?
No, exactly. That makes complete sense. And I think I have seen, I should say, a lot of different communities for whom they're not sure how to take the next steps. So the hammering is a form of flailing, right? It's we don't know what else there is in the toolkit, but I know this is here. At least I could use something.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the thing, right? Like, I can't blame folks, myself included. I can't blame folks if they only have one tool. Of course, they're going to use it. That's how I look at anger as well. Anger is and can be a tool. If that's the only emotion you are connected to, if that's the only emotion that's in your emotional vocabulary, of course you're going to use it. I can't fault you for that. I can fault you if we have gone over other options and you're still using that one like it's the only one. Right? So part of the reason I do the work I do as both a therapist and an organizer and a presenter is because I want to make sure that people are getting better acquainted with other tools, other options, other ideas for how to resolve conflict, for how to resolve abuse, for how to resolve just mistakes, for how to resolve, the ills of racism. Because if we don't have other options, how can we do things differently, right? But once we have them, and are starting to grow more familiar, that's when we can actually start doing things a little bit differently. But the first step has to be learning, right? The first step has to be getting acquainted with what other options are there.
Yeah.
And then learning to use them through practice. If you're not a mechanic and someone hands you all these like mechanic tools, clearly I'm not a mechanic because I can't even come up with the names of the tools. I'm like, these mechanical tools for whatever mechanics do with cars, these funnels and weird tubes. If they place those in front of me, I'd be like, that's nice. I have no idea what to do with any of these.
Or look at all the different sizes of hammers.
Yeah. It's like, I have no idea. Recently, funny, I recently started gardening. And it's like learning a new language. So all these different tools for gardening, all these different kinds of seeds, all this knowledge that I didn't even know I had to know about what your zone is. Are you zone 6B, 6A? All of this was just a different universe, and I had no idea what I was doing. And to be able to garden, which was my goal, I had to do learning. I had to start preparing first. I had to learn through practice, through trial and error, and also through consultations with other folks who knew more than I did. So one of my partners, I'm saying, I think that they're actually a plant just in human shape. They know a lot about plants. They know a lot about gardening. So part of what I did was ask them for help. And I read a lot, I researched a lot, and now I know a lot more about gardening than I did a few months ago. And the reason I'm comfortable with gardening now, to some extent, right, because it's a journey, it's not a final destination, it's because I had to take that time and I put in the hours, I put in the work to understand those tools and know how to use them.
No, that makes sense. Now, you brought up earlier the concept of this idea of trying to find your way around gender. And I want to make sure we come back to that. So I am horribly curious. Where are you thinking with that?
Oh my God, gender. What was I even talking about earlier? Gender's everywhere at this point in my life.
Gender. Oh my gosh. I feel you. I absolutely feel you. Because, sometimes... So I was having a conversation with a lovely lady last night who was probably, I want to say, in her 80s. And somebody was asking me, well, what do you do for lecturing? And it was at a very mixed 4th of July kind of experience. For those who are listening on here, we recorded this just earlier before you get to hear it. And I was at a 4th of July piece, and this lovely lady was like, what do you lecture on? I'm like, well, interpersonal relationships and things like gender. And she's like, well, in what way? Like, and I'm just trying not to have it be too far because I'm not sure where she's at. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, for example, talking about the differences between, gender and orientation. And she just looked at me point blank and said, well, I don't see why anyone would be confused about that. And I'm like, oh God. And then she waited like this half second, and then she smirked and like half winked. And I'm like, okay, gotcha. Because she was there with her daughter, who was a lesbian, and her daughter's wife. And so it was just that moment, though, where why would that be so confusing? And there are people for whom that is and is not a true statement, based on whether they even know things or not. It's, rewind. That notion of how does a person know what they don't know until they're having a discussion about it?
Exactly. And with gender, I mean, it's funny. I was having a conversation with one of my partners. I think it was just earlier today, where I was like, I really hope no one asks me to talk about my gender because there's so much to unpack and discuss there that I just don't want to have you having the conversation right now. And one of the pieces that I think is really relevant in terms of gender as a therapist is that gender is something that all of us have some experience with, right? Gender is a set of constructs, a set of beliefs, a set of rules, a set of bodily part. Like, gender is a big thing that can be hard to define, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But we all have some experience with it, whether in our own bodies, in the bodies of our partners, in the bodies of our family, in popular discourse, in media. Everyone has some level of opinion about gender. And with a lot of the folks that I work with, especially folks who are in any way gender variant or gender, questioning, gender can be a place where there's just a lot of pain. And one of the things that I find really important to try to do with them is figure out and acknowledge what those points of pain are, because usually those points of pain are not acknowledged by other people in their lives. And then see, okay, well, what are the points of possible joy, possible pleasure in gender or in your gender? And I'm not saying the points of pleasure. I'm saying the points of possible pleasure. I'm operating in the space of possibility, because trying to pin it down or trying to nail it down can be difficult. It can feel like you're making a commitment that maybe you're not ready to make. And so I like to think of it in hypotheticals and ideas and what ifs to start acquainting people with those possibilities and see if they're ones that they want to reach toward or not. And for a lot of folks where there's trauma and there's stuff around gender, like I was saying earlier, the body can be a really fraught place. The body can be a really complicated place to inhabit. And if your body is one of your tools, if not your primary tool, to experience sexuality, to experience intimacy or connection, how does that leave your ability to connect if your body's a place where you don't want to be? Mm-hmm. And so the idea of getting more connected with our bodies through whatever means necessary, like maybe it's gardening. Maybe gardening is what connects you to your body. I know that it is certainly one of the things that I am doing for myself. Gardening can be a very sensual, and I say sensual not in the like sexy way, but sensual as in the senses.
Right.
It's a very sensual experience. You're dealing with water, you're dealing with wind, you're dealing with earth, you're potentially dealing with fire if you're doing any kind of grilling with your veggies and plants, or just thinking of the sun being really hot on your head as you're watering your plants. And figuring out what places can you start that rebuilding, that reconnection. Because a lot of problems and a lot of interpersonal issues stem from disconnection, stem from turning away from struggle, turning away from those who love us, turning away from things that might be good, turning away from things that are painful. And often the process is to reverse that, to be like, okay, you've been disconnected. What if we connected now? What would that look like? And that can be terrifying. Dissociation, something that happens with a lot of folks. And, to a degree, I think we all dissociate at some point. Dissociation can be as simple and sort of mild as daydreaming. It's like kind of getting lost in a moment at a meeting. and really intense to a degree where you don't know who you are. You don't know how you got there. You've entered a fugue state of, not knowing what are the limits to your body, and it can be really scary. But all of that, again, is about connection, disconnection. And I ask, and I invite, rather, listeners to think about the places where they've disconnected either on purpose or accidentally. And what might it look like? What might it do to turn toward those places? Does it feel safe? Does it feel dangerous? Why? Are there reasons for that disconnection to be eternal? Can that disconnection have a time limit? Could you turn toward those places at some point? Is there something to be gained? Is there a relationship to be rejuvenated? Turning toward may just be, hey, I fought with my partner this morning and I was kind of a jerk. Let me turn toward them, apologize, or remind myself why I care about them. It might be turning toward an estranged family member. And that's going to take a much, much higher emotional toll probably, but might be worth exploring, right? So I just want folks to think about all those places of disconnection and what would it mean, what would it look like to potentially reconnect? Not because you have to do anything about it, but because the question may give you new insights. It might bring you to places that you hadn't thought of before or hadn't thought of in a long time. And when we think of questions and we think of situations that we haven't visited in a long time, sometimes things have changed. And it's time to do it differently. So that, I want to just put that out there for listeners, and I hope that springs some interesting questions and discussions for them.
No, absolutely. It popped off lots of different ideas in my head. I remember talking to somebody who was discussing how do I physically connect with my body when the person happened to work at Walmart 50 hours a week, standing on concrete. And when for your paycheck, you're having to ignore your body because of all that body pain that's happening when you work that many hours on concrete. How do you still connect with your body? And I think this goes back to being a multi-layered conversation.
Right. And again, that idea of dissociation or that idea of disconnecting from our body as a negative thing, I don't believe in it. I think that there are things that we do that are more or less helpful for our goals, more or less helpful for our lives. I don't super believe in this is a bad strategy. No. This is a good strategy. I'm like, this may be better. This may be less great. And that's definitely also my clinical training talking, right, of being non-judgmental, trying to hold space for people's, varied experiences, and something that I wish more folks that weren't therapists could also do, because we get so caught up in judging people for their decisions, even without knowing the context, that I think it would be really valuable if we changed to being more curious rather than immediately judgmental. Like, interesting. I maybe would not have done that. I'm really curious as to why this person did. And I'm wondering what was behind this situation or this action. And with folks that are, going back to the disconnection piece and the Walmart person, it can be really tricky to go from having to disconnect 8 to 10 hours a day, 5 days a week, to then being like, okay, I'm going to go reconnect at home. I'm going to take a nice little bubble bath. Because it can be a very jarring, like you're going to have whiplash from doing that. So sometimes I think the thing to do in those situations is figure out, okay, what are the pockets of time where you can reconnect? What are safe ways of reconnecting? And how do you smooth that transition, right? So for some people, what it might mean is that they disconnect a little bit less during the workday. Maybe they carry an object that they have that has some interesting texture to it, and they keep that in their pocket and they touch that periodically to ground them or to remind them that their body can feel things, not just pain. For some people, that looks like, keep staying pretty disconnected during the week, but doing other things to take care of their body, whether that's eating foods that are good for them, that feel nice, whether that's getting a certain amount of hours of sleep, whether that's, indulging in a really nice outfit or really nice lip color or hair color or something that makes them, stay connected and not just completely untethered. And then finding modes of connection where they can go in and out of them a little bit more easily on the weekend or on a day that they don't work. So for me, it's about finding the little moments, the little pockets, and smoothing the transition as best we can. And sometimes we do that by ourselves. Sometimes we do that with partners. These are things that we don't necessarily have to do alone. And if we can encourage these kinds of conversations between people, we can share our wisdom. And that takes us back to the thing that we were talking about right at the beginning, right? About technology, about community, about sharing stories with each other. We're so much stronger. We're so much, more resourced if we are using all our collective resources, if we are sharing our knowledge, than having to reinvent the wheel every time. I hate, my biggest pet peeve is reinventing the wheel. I'm like, we already got it. Why do we got to do it again? We don't have to. Mm-hmm. So if we share stories and if we're sharing our vulnerabilities and our struggles and things like that, we don't have to face the entire weight of having to fix everything by ourselves. And that goes back to activism. If we know that we are part of a larger system, of a larger web of revolutionaries, of people trying to make the world better, of trying to change things for the better, we generally feel less stressed because we know that it's not just us. We know that we're not alone. We know that it's not just up to us to fix everything. And especially for those of us, pointing very pointedly at myself right now, for those of us who are, perfectionists or who have a lot of feelings about justice, sometimes we can get really overwhelmed with how bad things can be and how bad things are. But we can't do this work without hope. And if we think of, again, the connection of ancestors and looking at those who are going to come after us, how can we be all part of a system of change? How can we all be tied together to make a better world? And we have to do that through relationships. That's one of the strongest tools that we have, connection.
That's beautiful and greatly appreciated that you are doing that work and reminding yourself at the same time that you have to do it, because I appreciate that finger being pointed round at me too. So thank you. I just want to say thank you, truly, for coming on the show today. It was really delicious to get to hear some of your thoughts.
Thank you. And, the pointing our fingers at ourselves, I think is really crucial, right? If we're seen as experts or if we're seen as leaders, I'm very against the idea of, how to put it nicely. I'm really against the idea of seeing ourselves as exceptions. Mm-hmm. This idea of I am exempt from critique and blame because I am Mr. Toppy Top. I am Mr. whatever. I am Madame Leader of Religion X. And the more that, that's another way of disconnecting. Mm-hmm. That's another way of putting ourselves really high atop a mountain that makes us seem like an exception when we aren't. Nope. And that harms not just our communities, but that harms us. Mm-hmm. That makes it really hard to ask for help. That makes it really hard to admit when we're wrong. That makes it really hard to exist. So the more that we can reduce those differences, the more that we can humble ourselves, the more that we can take ourselves off pedestals and request that we do not get put on them, I think that the better our communities as a whole will be, and the more just and fair our communities will be. But that's hard work because we've been taught to worship, folks on pedestals, and we've been taught to do that, especially, if some of us have practices where the religious iconography lends itself to that too, right? Mm-hmm. So figuring out a way to de-pedestal, I think is really valuable and transformative as well.
Well, I think people sometimes forget that when you put somebody on a pedestal, you are objectifying them. When we turn somebody into an idol, we are creating an idol, as in a physical object that represents something else rather than being the thing itself. The words that we use, sometimes people forget actually representing exactly what they are. And if I didn't consent to be objectified, right, or we didn't think through the fact that we've been idolized, it's a chance for us to go, wow, do I really want to be here? Is this what needs to happen? Is this what's best for myself and the world that I'm part of?
Exactly. And what's that phrase, the higher you are, the harder you fall? Yeah. The higher the pedestal, the more devastating it is when that person on the pedestal makes a mistake. Mm-hmm. And we go back to this idea of having to hide our mistakes, never admitting to making mistakes, gaslighting people who think we ever messed up, because we're so high up on this pedestal that it would be easier and it would be more just, like I said, more just and fairer if we were not doing that, because we would have an easier time integrating. Again, here's a therapy speak.
I
We'd
love
have
it.
an easier time integrating that knowledge instead of compartmentalizing. Compartmentalizing is colloquially used differently than how we use it in therapy, but this idea of holding very conflicting and contradictory beliefs at the same time, and sometimes that coming out in a hypocritical way, because we just can't make sense of them together. Like so many of us have been taught, if this person is a good leader in the community, they cannot be abusive. If they have been really monumental in moving our field forward, they cannot possibly be this monster that would harm someone on purpose.
Yeah.
And that's a false dichotomy. And those false dichotomies are really harmful. And they lead to a lot of the shit that we just talked about, right? So if we see things more on a spectrum, whether that's gender, whether that's violence, whether that's pain, whether that's pleasure, and have a less binary view of it, we're going to have an easier time locating ourselves in it. We're going to have an easier time finding spaces that feel authentic, because the falsehood here is that two choices make it easier. Like, that makes it easier on the axis of having little choice and picking one or the other, but it doesn't actually lead us to fulfillment.
Yeah.
Having more options can be stressful, can be difficult. If you feel like it's not just men and women out there in terms of gender, now maybe you have a headache because you're trying to figure out where you fit in, whereas it used to be so simple. But ultimately, at the other end of that struggle, at the other end of that line of questioning, there can be a more authentic and embodied and connected version of you, because you were given choice. You were given options rather than just, well, you got either combo 1 or combo 2. What you're going to pick?
Mm-hmm. No, exactly. Well, thank you for taking the time to come on the show. I appreciate it.
All right. It was lovely. Thank you so much.
All right. And where can people find you if they're looking for more information?
I'm upsettingly easy to find on the internet.
I love it. I love it.
So as long as you know my name, you can find me. I'm on Twitter as Neuron Bomb. I'm on Facebook. I'm on all the social medias. So as long as you got my name, you can probably find me. And I'm based out of Boston, Massachusetts, but I tend to travel around for conferences and other things. So stay tuned on social media if you want to ever connect in person or bring me to where you are.
I love it. And for folks who want to know those links, or right now you're on a bus or wherever it might be, feel free to go over to my website, passionandsoul.com. And over on the podcast page, you can get all of our different show notes that come with every single one of the podcasts that include links to some of the different events, groups, or concepts that we've mentioned today for doing further reading and learning. You can also find me over on iTunes by typing in Lee, L-E-E, Harrington, or over on Stitcher or any of the other fine streaming systems out there by looking up Passion and Soul. And until next time, stay cool, have fun, find the places where you can learn, live, grow, and embrace yourself, and be authentically you.